One thing I spoke about in one of my Reels runs recently was relative good and evil. Now, that does sound like there is going to be a disparity between what most Christians say, that being that there's an ultimate good and an ultimate evil, which is God and the devil, or God and not God, if you will. However, again, as I constantly preach, context matters. So I'm going to explain this to you whilst I'm driving. There is an ultimate standard of good and evil. That is the moral argument. But you've got to remember that what is good for one person isn't necessarily good for another. Understanding the general position or the general standard of good and evil certainly helps us navigate through life, but what is ultimately good isn't going to be effectively good for certain people involved. A good example of this is taxes, if you will, because whilst we do need to pay our taxes, and higher taxes means ultimately more money in the economy, hence benefiting the country as a whole, there are individuals who will suffer because of it. So that is where relative evil occurs. A high tax level means that those who don't have enough will struggle, even if the general economy benefits. That is often the moral dilemma. Does ultimate good benefit the most people, or does it benefit those who need benefiting more? Unfortunately, it's a top-down pyramid, if you will, with those that have the most generally having less to give, or giving less, but they have more as a result of them having more. If you will, it's sort of the economic gravity. Mass attracts more mass. Thus, bigger items attract smaller items. That's general Newtonian physics for you. Even Einsteinian relativity explains that, or at least has that as its basic principle. A bigger item distorts space-time more, and thus will attract more things, or at least have more things drawn into its gravity well. So, how do we rectify ultimate good and evil with relative good and evil? It is sort of like the theory of everything paradox. How we can rectify quantum physics with relativity. In this case, it's understanding where relative morality lies on the general spectrum of good and evil. To call it relative morality is a bit of a misnomer. It's better to call it relative good and evil. But that's where you have to balance the greater good and the lesser evil. Now, as I'm driving through Edinburgh, say if I have a passenger in the back, they need to get to, let's say, Waverley Station. A very good place. Could stop there for fuel as well. Would have been rather useful. But I've got other jobs to do, so I need to be quick. So I move on. I find another petrol station, maybe not as cheap as fuel, but I'll get my customer to the station in good time. The tricky thing is then I need to find another fuel station. It might not be as cheap, but it's still a fuel station. I'll still get to put fuel in this vehicle. A classic example would be Christian motoring, I suppose, because you got the best flow for everyone. Naturally you think you're flowing, so is everyone. But that's not always the case, because it's easy to barge into traffic and say, yes, I'm still moving, when you just cut up half a mile of traffic. I'm going to see a bus ahead of me in the bus stop. Best flow for me would be to barge right past, but I can see he's signalling already, so I'm going to ease back. And I can also see there's a cyclist behind them. Again, best flow for me to barge past, but I'm not sure if I can fit through. But then again, there's a bicycle lane on my left, so they've got plenty of room, so I can slip past, avoid the traffic island, and give them the space they need. One parenting tip that my brother and his partner mentioned was to not constantly say to their daughter, be careful, because how do they know what to be careful about if you're just telling them that? But they don't. So what do? You ask them to consider how the situations... Wait, that makes sense. You ask them to consider if it's safe, if it's slippy, if it's strong enough for them. So if they're climbing a tree, is that branch strong enough? Is it too slippy? Can you reach the next branch? Is it stable? You're asking them to make assessments, if you will, teaching them to make risk assessments. That's what I'll be teaching my niece as well. Not just to be careful, but how to assess what is a sensible place to be. Identify the hazard, figure out how to avoid it, and then move around it. Same in combat. You don't blast straight in. You figure out what your opponent's doing, and then decide how to work around it. Same in traffic, same in all things in life. You consider the risks and work out what is best to avoid them. Now in this case, I'm currently stuck behind someone wanting to turn right, and I know I'm going to struggle to get past. I might even have to wait until the lights cycle out, but I'm right on a crossing here. It's not ideal. So, can I move into the left lane? In theory, I could. In fact, there's a gap there. I can slip in without trouble. There we go. And the car behind me has done the same, even though I've nearly gone for gears. There are people behind who will think, oh, he's being cheeky, he's moved out of his lane. I'm doing what is good for my flow, I'm doing what's good for the flow behind me. Understanding how things flow and how things can be relative to each other is important. You may think being nice and close to the car in front of you will mean that you have mean that you take up less room on the road, and thus you're not holding up anyone. But that close-knit traffic makes it harder for ambulances to move through. And I can see on the bypass, things are getting pretty tight. So I slightly worry for people trying to get through to, say, the airport. But it's those situations you need to constantly be aware of. And the same with good and evil. So what's as an ultimate standard of good that we should aspire to? Is that something we can even reach? I would say yes. But even if we can't, why shouldn't we aim for it? I remember hearing something somewhere. If I can find the quote, I will reference it. But it was something like, if you aim for the moon, you will never fall short. An example my dad gives constantly in singing is when reaching for the high notes, you're not reaching up to it, you're reaching over and touching the note. So you're not straining to reach the underneath of it, you're putting something on it. He gives the example of not reaching up to a shelf of a cup, it's reaching up and placing a cup on a shelf. So you're not pushing up, you're reaching over. Aim for something greater than you can achieve, and you're more than likely going to succeed in a lot of other things on the way. You could say it's similar to archery. You aim slightly higher for distance. Another example might be in jobs. When you're applying for a job, you will basically try and make it seem like as though you're slightly overqualified for the position. Not too much, otherwise they might put you in a position where you're not actually suited at all. But just enough that they think, oh, you'll be a real asset to this team. So God may have put a standard out there that we can't ultimately reach. But when you consider that he knows we fall apart, we're not perfect. He never made perfect to be part of the world. Perfect wasn't even part of the Bible until Genesis chapter 6. No version of it has it any earlier than that. It didn't even say that mankind was the perfect being. He didn't say Adam was perfect. He never said any of the animals were perfect. So where Richard Dawkins gets the idea that animals were perfect the way they were is really questionable. So he knows that we are aiming for a standard we can't achieve. But that's the standard he sets for us. And even if we fail, even if we fall short, which we're bound to do, he's like, well done. You've done your best. And that's doing good. When we choose not to try our best, That's when we fail. That is when evil comes into the world. A sin isn't because you missed the goal by accident. Often it's because you knew where the goal was and decided not to aim for it. I don't know of an easy way to describe it. I think the best demonstration is in one of the early episodes of Tracy Beaker. There was a TV show about it. And sorry, Tracy Beaker. I grew up watching it. That's how I became so sympathetic towards people in the foster care system. So even though people were trashing on my girlfriend at the time, who was in the foster care system, I was like, I'll watch Tracy Beaker. She's not bad. Leave her alone. But in that episode, someone had, I think just sprayed icing on custard or something onto the social worker. And they were trying to figure out who it was. Basically just a Sherlock Holmes style show. Little sleuth stuff going on. So they set up a target and had people shoot various weapons. I think it was a squirt gun, a water cannon, and a water blaster, and a big pirate cannon. Now, the person who had the water pistol, that was, what was her name? Roxy Wellard. Yeah. I don't know the actress's name, but she was told to aim at her brother. She turned it onto the person holding the sheet and shot him. She knew the target, she chose something else. That, I think, is a classic example of evil. Not to say Roxy was evil. She was a menace, no doubt about that, but